Hello and a very warm welcome to the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Humor. This is our 39th mini-episode. Many thanks for joining us. Special shout out to our first-time listeners. Welcome aboard. The podcast has seen a steady march up in its numbers over the past year. We also have an extraordinary loyal listening base, as over 75% of those who have downloaded an episode have downloaded at least 10. So many thanks to you guys for that. If you're new to the podcast, you may want to look at our webpage, the Internet of Things Madesimple.com, which has a wealth of material on IoT, including ebooks, links to blogs, and older podcasts, and much more. Finally, as I always do, I ask you both to subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast service, and if that podcast service allows you to leave a comment or a review, kindly do so. One of the goals that I have always strived to achieve in over 20 years in IoT is to simplify. Try to use examples and to explain things in a manner that most people will understand. IoT is a very complex thing if you want to think of it that way. As I said in the book, most people are interested in knowing how it applies to them and how it affects their life or their business. This week, we're going to look at IoT security, and namely 10 security risks that, according to Deloitte, must be addressed by companies or organizations to have a successful IoT implementation. For each one, I know I could just read out the list, but for one, you're able to read yourself, and you don't need me to do that. But more importantly, many of these need some context to be easily understood. We will endeavor to do that, talking about how each point will affect organizations of all shapes and sizes. On to number 1. The first one is about having a security plan at all, which many organizations, especially the smaller ones, do not. Remember, a plan doesn't have to be complex, and it often doesn't even need to be done by the organizations themselves at all. In a previous series that we concluded last week, which is mini episode 34 to 37, we covered 4 important steps that you need to go through to ensure a proper IoT solution rollout. We discussed how, depending on the size of your organization, many companies are best to consider a turnkey solution, which is where your solution provider provides all aspects of a solution. If you're doing that, you may not have to consider too much about security, other than ensuring things like protecting your devices from being stolen. In those podcasts, we did talk about how many companies like to do things themselves, especially the larger ones, and what they do is select different components and they handle the overall solution rollout. If this is you, you do need to take security points that are provided by the hardware and the software vendors, and then top up the plan to ensure that things are smooth. The good thing is that there are plenty of companies who can help you out with this. But regardless of who provides the components to your solution, a security plan is not an option. It is a must. Point number 2 happens once a plan is in place, and that's who's responsible for it. A plan is only as good as the effort given to ensure its success. All the planning in the world will go to waste if things like security updates are not installed and security rules are not enforced. Many will look to the IT department to first put together a plan and then to enforce it, and this is usually a good place to start. But what if you're really small and you don't have a formal IT department? Or what if your devices are thousands of miles or kilometers away from the team and they have little influence as to how the devices are handled or used? Luckily, there is some help here. Most IoT devices can be updated over the air, and this includes enforcing things like passwords and changing security settings as time goes on. However, it needs to go beyond that. Management needs to ensure there is compliance for security. One example may be that it's prohibited to share passwords or let somebody else borrow your password. They also need to be diligent in removing access to employees quickly if they leave the organization. IoT security, like any other form of security, needs to be practiced by everyone in the company. Otherwise, there is huge risks to the organization. Point number 3 is a massive pet peeve of mine, and something I've spoken about maybe a little too much. Security not being incorporated into the design of a product or a system. While the lack of security of many IoT products is kind of a concern for consumers, it can be a disaster for a professional organization. I have long advocated that a minimum standard of security needs to be maintained and put into every IoT device, and security needs to be turned on by default. If a user decides to turn it off, that is their dumb choice. It goes beyond that, though. Hardware needs to incorporate things like a unique username and password for each device, something that even most home routers fail to do, and scarily, many commercial-grade cellular routers do this as well, and encryption of data needs to be turned on by default. The last point is many IT departments have sophisticated security plans for their laptops and tablets, but often not for their IoT products. One reason why will be covered in the next point. The same level of security planning, security enforcement, and routine checks needs to be incorporated into your IoT systems. If not, you're leaving yourself way too open for hackers. I hinted on this a couple of minutes ago, but number 4 is how there's a lack of security awareness among many companies' engineering and security architects when it comes to IoT. This unfortunately does make sense. Despite the fact that computers and networks have been around for decades, there are still security gaps that hackers can exploit in many traditional IT systems. IoT networks are quite new and often incorporate technologies that are both not taught in most engineering programs and are changing so fast that it's difficult to keep up with them. Companies need to be aware of this and even, slow down deployments until their team has the knowledge to properly secure them. In response to point number 4, you might say, well, doesn't the company just hire some security consultants to get things set up right? And that is a good point, except point number 5 is there's a lack of IoT and IIoT, which we'll talk about in a future podcast, security and privacy resources available. IoT has grown with such incredible force that there's a lack of resources available to companies in all areas of the industry. Product and software companies are often short-staffed to be able to implement all of the security features they may wish to have, and security providers often overwork their limited security team members. Finally, organizations are also not able to find someone for their internal projects. The obvious answer to all these issues is, well, let's just graduate more people from these programs. Long term, that's what will happen, but there are going to be some short-term issues. First, most of these projects require very specialized skills and training, and there may not be as many people out there who have the standards and the skills to meet the demand. Similarly, people want to hire employees with real-life experience. Even once we graduate people from these courses, it will take some time to get them the experience that most people desire. Let's imagine that you have the right system in place and a great overall security plan. You have excellent buy-in from all the parties in your company, and you found some very skilled people who are working for you in the field of IoT security. Everything is perfect, right? Not exactly. Point number 6 is that if you have insufficient levels of monitoring to detect issues, you are just as vulnerable as if you had no plan in the first place. This may include the ability to be notified of unwanted access to certain areas, as well as having action plans to quickly fix things like devices being stolen. Whatever the plan is, you have to have ways to quickly detect issues and to take action on them. Point number 7 is kind of nerdy, even for me. The official statement was the lack of post-market and implementation security and privacy risk management. Now, I'm a sales guy by nature. I'm not even sure what that means. Perhaps somebody can send me a note and tell me. What I will say instead is that one area of security is always what's referred to as the last mile. You can have all of the back-end security in the world, but if your guys in the field are constantly leaving their windows open in the McDonald's parking lots and your devices are not secured in your vehicle, you have a major security risk that your IT guys might never have considered. This is also where you need to factor in things like how you can ensure only your authorized devices are added to your network, how you can enforce minimum software versions for remote devices that never come back into the office, and how do you secure devices in the event that they're stolen, which we referenced earlier. This may mean things like devices will log out after a certain time, or you can limit the level of data that can be accessed from remote devices in terms of sensitivity. We kind of hinted at number 8 in a couple of previous points, and it's how you need to have visibility to your products. This includes things like how quickly you are notified if a device is offline, how aware you are if devices have required settings or security patches, and how you're able to lock down your network to prevent an unwanted device from gaining access. One point here is that some of these traditional issues have sprung out of IT teams who have refused to approve or deploy IoT solutions. For the first decade or so of IoT's existence, we rarely worked with IT teams during our implementation. It was almost always the operation team who wanted to know the status of key assets, and they set up a closed system to do so. While this was far from ideal, the systems were set up in a way that if they were attacked, there was little or no link to the rest of the organization. So in an odd way, there was a limit to the risk. That's a bit different from today, where many IoT devices are set up across the internet using the same networks that vital data and transactions are sent across, and this can be a disaster. Just look at how Target's financial systems were compromised by an attack that gained access through their smart HVAC system. IT teams need to be involved and ensure that IoT traffic stays off the main connections, and if it does not, at least there are safety guards in place. Part of this is having a full understanding of all the IoT products that are deployed at sites. So they need to balance their willingness to accept IoT devices versus the needs to have certain requirements. If they make it too hard to get IoT devices put in, other departments will go around them, and this can lead to huge issues. Number 9 deals with how security is handled on legacy, or maybe less sophisticated devices, if you want to call it that. In my book, I spoke about how the US military had many secure locations in the Middle East compromised by the use of Fitbits by their soldiers. It seems that through their desire to stay in shape, many were using Fitbits to maintain a certain level of activity. When enough people walked on the same path, the pattern is picked up and added as a path or a road. This happened in many secure camps. Luckily, there were no major catastrophes, at least none reported. While this is a very unique example, it does bring up a great point. How are you able to handle security for IoT devices that either aren't capable of much security or are older and their software has not been updated to handle the security tools used by your team? In some cases, the manufacturer of the device can help, but with many organizations having different IoT devices out there, this can be an issue. Another issue here comes from a story that I've heard from a large municipality, one with millions of residents. It seems that many of their departments love the idea of using vehicle tracking. Unfortunately, they all deployed their own solutions, so at one point there were dozens of different devices and solutions connected to vehicles owned by the city. This means that there wasn't a single pane of glass or screen that could show all the vehicles during a time of disaster. Since they did not want to pay for cancellation fees, the city decided to wait until all their contracts were up. While it did take a few years, the city was able to standardize on one vendor, ensuring a high level of security and visibility into their organization and probably saving themselves some money. If you're part of a similar size organization, you might want to do a bit of research here yourself. The final point has to do with many companies having an immature level of incident response. This may involve many things, including the ability to physically go out to each site in the event of a major issue. However, for the purposes of this podcast, I want to talk about an important thing. Does your team still have its dogfighting skills? I've used reference to the movie Top Gun a lot over the years, but it is appropriate here. For those who have not seen the movie, first, what the heck is wrong with you? Go see the movie. And second, the idea of Top Gun was that pilots had grown lazy and were relying too much on technology. So they had forgotten how to use the dogfighting skills that pilots used for decades before technology was put on board. The same can happen with your team. As they start to rely more and more on IoT, it often means they are not familiar with or not even trained on how to do things in the event the IoT technology is not available. While this might not happen right away, it's something that can happen quicker than you think. You need to ensure that you're able to deal with security issues quickly, and part of this is that you may need to temporarily go back to your old solution. Ensure that your team remembers how to do that. As always, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We look forward to having you join us for the next episode, which we're going to cover some things the IoT industry does not want you to know. Yeah, we kind of spilled the beans a little bit. We'd love to hear from you, good, bad, and ugly. First place to start is our Facebook page, The Internet of Things Made Simple, where we also have some links to some previous material. If I'm connected to you on my LinkedIn page, drop me a note through that service. And if we're personally connected, drop me an old-fashioned email or text. Talk to you soon. I'm Larry by Humor. Take care.